Thank you. Thank you for that introduction, and thank you to the Angara Centre for inviting me to this meeting, whose content so far I have greatly enjoyed and learned from. By way of introduction, I want to emphasize that I represent myself, no one else. Nothing I say should be construed as the opinion of Stanford University, the U.S. government, or any other organization or government that now exists or has ever existed anywhere on this planet. Diplomats typically avoid what-if questions and hypothetical remarks. Ian referred to the comfort zone of academics being endangered by the prospect of having to predict. But in my experience, academics typically enjoy hypotheticals, possibilities, implications, speculations, subjectivity. I am an academic, not a diplomat, and I will be hypothetical. I'm unlikely to say anything quotable, but if I do, I urge any journalists in the room not to quote me out of context and not to confuse speculation with prediction, or mere fancy with actual fact. The title of our effort today is What is to be Done? Resolving Maritime Disputes in Southeast Asia. Now, there are lots of questions one can ask about that title. For example, what is to be done by whom? There's a question, I think, that sort of runs on the margins of this meeting as to the burden of responsibility. Is it China that has to do all the doing? Or can the Philippines do something significant? Or can ASEAN do something? Should the United States do something? Should Japan do something? And so forth. The allocation of responsibility is a question that we haven't directly addressed so far. It's lurking on the margins. It strikes me as a critical question. And what if the answer to this question, what is to be done, is nothing? What if nothing can be done to resolve these disputes? Now, that's a kind of pessimistic note, but remember this morning we were realistic. I'm not sure to what extent realism fades into pessimism. But what if nothing can be done to resolve these disputes? I remember some years ago being in Kuala Lumpur listening to a colleague, a Malaysian colleague, say, you know, Professor Emmerson, get used to it. This is China's. China is going to be hegemonic in Southeast Asia. Period. Paragraph. It's a little bit like global warming, right? Instead of trying to prevent it, you try to adapt to it. That's a very controversial thought. And I'm not going to just leave it at that and leave you with the impression that I do believe that this is a Greek tragedy unfolding whose end cannot be avoided. The famous Thucydides trap, right, that we are on the verge of a Peloponnesian War, just as happened between Athens and Sparta, that when a rising power rises, necessarily there is conflict. And I do not believe that that is inevitable. I do, however, feel that we should, in all fairness, put that question at least on the table. And if the disputes in question in the South China Sea, or what I'm going to refer to as the SCS, just to save time and syllables, if the questions are over sovereignty, I think among analysts, and I think this morning's conversation perhaps illustrates this, pessimism has become virtually a conventional wisdom. The contradictions over sovereignty, after all, are long-standing, intractable, and arguably may never be resolved. Now, that's not necessarily as bad a prospect as one might think, if they can be sequestered, partitioned, so that they do not affect peace and stability in Southeast Asia. That's a tricky business, but it is not impossible. And if those sovereignty disputes are resolved, that outcome could result from imposition rather than negotiation. And of course, the prime candidate for the role of imposer is China, due to its size, its proximity, and recently its behavior. Its effort, indeed, so far, its success and its impunity in creating facts on the ground, what the French call faits accomplis, which then have to be taken into account as the situation is incrementally changed and it becomes the new usual, the new normal. Their success in creating facts on the ground by seizing, surrounding, and augmenting land features, on the water by claiming authority over roughly 4/5 of the SCS, and now in the air over the East China Sea. If I may speculate, but definitely not predict, conceivably in the air over the South China Sea as well. Now this morning, Senator Angara quoted the Chinese ambassador to the Philippines. as having said that an ADIZ, that is an Air Defense Independence Zone, which I think is easier, again, just to use the shorter abbreviation, ADIZ, that an ADIZ will be established over the SCS, over the South China Sea. But according to the, well, I have to say there are two views on this. According to one weekly in Hong Kong, whose reliability I cannot vouch for, as conveyed by a recent report in the Japan Times, quote, a Chinese defense official has said that the country plans to establish an ADIZ also over the Yellow Sea and the South China Sea. On the other hand, the Chinese ambassador herself has been quoted by the Inquirer, a newspaper here in Manila, as having said merely that, quote, it is within China's sovereignty to set up another ADIZ. And she apparently went on to say, quote, I cannot tell if there will be new air identification zones. And she repeated that she could not predict the matter one way or the other. Indeed, one Chinese analyst, with some knowledge of the situation, has said to me privately that Beijing will not declare an ADIZ over the South China Sea. On the other hand, authoritative, perhaps, is an on-the-record statement made by an official in the Chinese Ministry of Defense. Quote, China, he said, will, not may or could, will establish other area defense identification zones at the right moment after necessary preparations are completed, unquote. Now this raises a question. Can actors other than China influence China's decision regarding the rightness of the moment, whether the right moment has arrived? Ian said this morning that ASEAN can only move at the speed that China wants it to. There's a lot of reason to believe that that is the case, but it does not follow that ASEAN cannot influence Chinese policy, which raises my first recommendation, that ASEAN, or the 5 claimants other than China, leaving aside Taiwan, which is a separate case, a fascinating case that I don't have time to explore, that ASEAN, or the 5 claimants other than China, should jointly state that Beijing, and do this now, that Beijing should not declare an ADIZ over the South China Sea. And state further that if China does so anyway, ASEAN, or the 5 claimants, will not comply, or will reserve the right not to comply, if we want to soften that, make it a little more diplomatic, with the rules through which China intends to implement such a zone over the SCS. It seems to me that this would at least put China on notice that it cannot expect the same sort of surprise that accompanied its declaration of an ADIZ with regard to the East China Sea. Will this have some hampering effect on the likelihood of China declaring an ADIZ over the South China Sea? I don't really know. And there's a separate question of whether it's even feasible. And if it isn't feasible, perhaps if ASEAN can't agree, or the claimants can't agree, then the question becomes, should the Philippines, for instance, make a statement saying that it will reserve the right not to comply with the Southeast Asian ADIZ initiated unilaterally by China. My second and somewhat broader recommendation is that the United States, in cooperation with ASEAN, the European Union, Japan, other interested countries, should facilitate a draft international agreement that would regularize the rules regarding ADIZs, those that already exist and those that might be proposed in the future. Now, this is very speculative indeed, not easy to achieve. Meanwhile, ASEAN, or a subset of its members, could single out as especially objectionable in China's ADIZ its encompassing of land features claimed by other countries. I mean, that's sort of a no-brainer. This would put Beijing on notice that it ought not declare an ADIZ over the South China Sea that would cover already disputed land features and already contested sea space. Such advance notice coming from Southeast Asia could at least marginally influence the timing and possibly the content of a Chinese ADIZ over the South China Sea. Meanwhile, in the much longer run, the proliferation of ADIZs since 9/11, and if we look back on the history, there certainly was an upsurge after that, which is perhaps to be expected, given the heightened sensitivity for security, and the rising possibility of overlap between ADIZs, the density, the sheer density of traffic in the skies, including drones, and the attendant risk of mid-air accidents, these may become incentives to launch an international effort to draft, very speculative, an UNCLOA, a UN Convention on the Law of the Air. Perhaps endowed even with an ITLOA, an International Tribunal of the Law of the Air. Very speculative, very long-term, but I think interesting. I'm trying to think outside the box. If such a tribunal existed today, one could even imagine a unilateral initiative, let's say by Japan, to ask the tribunal to constitute an arbitral court to determine the legality of China's ADIZ, applying the Philippine innovation to the air. Now, a blanket objection to any recommendation that ASEAN should do this or should do that is that such advice completely misunderstands the purely consultative nature of ASEAN, whose ability to engage in collective action is a prisoner of the need for consent by its most reluctant member. But ASEAN will increasingly face, indeed I think already does face, a dilemma to retain the ASEAN way of consensus at the price of irrelevance as regards the most consequential issues that threaten Southeast Asian security, or to allow for minilateral, at least minilateral ASEAN minus X initiatives, coalitions, small coalitions of the willing, that may actually threaten the unity and centrality of the association. The centrality of the association has become an act of faith in ASEAN doctrine. And frankly, the more it is repeated as the necessary sine qua non for the existence of ASEAN, the more obvious it is that ASEAN is worried that its centrality is slipping. On the economic front, the very fact that we have the CJK in Northeast Asia, right, China, Japan, South Korea, already having reached an agreement on investment and now debating an agreement on trade, suggests that in the economic sphere, ASEAN's hitherto hub-like status as the center of various networks of cooperation, ASEAN plus this plus that, may be increasingly diminished. And imagine if the center of economic gravity were to generate a center of political gravity in Northeast Asia, then ASEAN centrality would become increasingly fictive. An ASEAN political security community will be declared, as you know, by the end of 2015. Indonesia has a somewhat proprietary role in the design and orientation of this community. Depending partly on events in the coming 2 years, it is conceivable, again speculation, that with Indonesian encouragement, ASEAN's political security community could legitimate, at least rhetorically, more robust steps with regard to the risks and dangers so evident in the South China Sea and in the East China Sea today. There are some in Indonesia, I think, who would like this to happen, but of course Indonesia, large, but still only one member of the ASEAN community. Now, on the subject of fatalism, one can, of course, suggest a worst-case scenario that sovereignty conflicts will not only not be resolved, but that they will lead to a new Cold War, or even perhaps a hot war, pitting China against the United States and or Japan. And that leads to another recommendation, that limited and proportional deterrence, a word that is almost absent, in fact I think it is, absent from the rhetorical vocabulary of ASEAN, deterrence, because that's traditional security, old-fashioned means, weaponry and so forth, force, which is anathema from the standpoint of an ASEAN way that emphasizes non-traditional security, which might be likened to the low-hanging fruit, the easier stuff of getting together to debate something that everybody faces because it's cross-border in character, whether that be, infectious disease, piracy, and so forth. It's easier to get together against those kinds of threats than it is to acknowledge the importance of physical, muscular deterrence to prevent traditional insecurity or to reduce it. And the deterrence, therefore, should be, and I say deterrence in the sense of a limited and proportional deterrence. I'm not trying to get into an arms race in Southeast Asia, quite the contrary. that limited and proportional deterrence be acknowledged by the states that are involved as appropriate, an appropriate preventive measure to increase the chance of preserving peace and promoting stability in Southeast Asia. One doesn't know how such a statement coming out of Southeast Asia would be received in Beijing, but insofar as it might cause certain second thinking, second thoughts with regard to the present pattern that we see of tit-for-tat escalation, perhaps it would have value. Now, I also want to talk about a subject that has not really been broached so far, understandably, and that is U.S. policy. And I say this primarily as an American citizen. One question that may come up, and let me just say that it is coming up because I'm about to put it on the table, is whether the pivot is now archival. The American pivot, the famous pivot associated not just with the Obama administration, but in particular with Hillary Clinton. Here I agree completely with Ian that she was a spectacularly talented Secretary of State. That's not an advertisement for her presidential chances, which is beyond my policy brief. But it does raise the question as to where the pivot is now, the famous pivot. Now, the first thing I want to say is that for decades, coming to Southeast Asia and talking with policy wonks such as myself, Southeast Asian policy wonks, it has been almost a litany to encounter the concern, the worry, the anxiety. Can we count on you to be around? And that's a major difference between China and the U.S. China can be counted on to be around. All you do is open a geography book. A map answers that question. And it does seem to me that although it is a realistic question, because the Americans could, at some point, stay on the eastern side of the Pacific Ocean, it also perhaps represents, at least sometimes, less a realistic understanding that the United States really could ever withdraw from Asia and cease being a Pacific power. And that it illustrates more a kind of anxiety that is perhaps a natural attribution of smaller countries living on the edge here in East Asia of a much larger one. Now, there are several ways in which one can look at this question. First of all, one could argue that the funds are simply unavailable in the U.S. Sequestration, the chaos, the humiliating, embarrassing, ugly chaos that is governance in the United States at the moment, with the legislative branch never having been less popular, polarization. I don't need to go into the woes of the American political system, but they are deep and they are severe. That, it seems to me, is a serious issue. But so far, knock on wood, funding is not a problem. In part because the pivot has so much symbolic value. Yes, it is impressive to have not just the Chinese ship coming through Southeast Asia, but also to have American 7th Fleet arriving as well. But I think the symbolic character of the pivot really should not be underestimated. It's a question of policy, at least as much as a question of weaponry. So I am relatively optimistic on that front. As far as leadership is concerned, it's important to note that John Kerry has spent a lot more time in the Middle East trying to solve that problem than he has in Southeast Asia. And it is understandable that when someone comes in with a position like that, they ask themselves, what kind of a legacy do I want to leave? For what achievement will I be granted the Nobel Peace Prize? And I think the answer in John Kerry's case is that his focus on the Syrian problem, the Iranian problem, and the Palestine-Israel problem illustrates where he thinks he would like to make his mark. Having said that, however, there's no question, and I think the recent declaration of an ADIZ by China, on Biden's trip to Beijing, and remember that there are approximately 50 to 60, I tried counting them, different platforms for bilateral China-US interaction that is ongoing, rich, deep, in really all sectors, economic, social, cultural, and of course in the military sector. It's interesting that the RIMPAC exercise next year will for the first time involve Chinese participation, assuming that they follow up on their willingness to join that exercise. So there are some encouraging developments that suggest that China and East Asia and Southeast Asia are very much on the horizon of American policymakers. And in that regard, I think one could exaggerate the extent to which the pivot is being reversed into a pivot back to the Middle East. Now, there is the question of containment. China argues that the pivot illustrates a desire for containment. Interestingly enough, China's recent behavior, which suggests a kind of self-containment, actually makes the pivot look a little less guilty in that regard, although maybe that's a somewhat overly clever interpretation. There is a real problem of entrapment. The United States clearly does not wish to be entrapped in a partisan defense of a particular position with regard to what, for many Americans' perspective, I have to be honest, is, a bunch of rocks. Even though, obviously, as we know, there's a lot more at stake there. The issue of entrapment should not be underestimated as a cautionary note that will, I think, continue to characterize the unwillingness of the United States to take, 100% of the side of a given party in these disputes, either in the South China Sea or, for that matter, in the East China Sea. And then there is the issue of hypocrisy. I asked an Indonesian colleague not too long ago whether he thought that the United States should publicly denounce the 9-line as being incompatible with UNCLOS. And he said no, because you would be blatantly hypocritical. After all, you have not ratified the law of the sea. So how can you stand there and say you other people really should do what it says? Now, in fairness to the American position, as many of you know, the United States treats UNCLOS as customary law. So it's not that the United States is assiduously trying to violate the terms of UNCLOS day by day. Here, unfortunately, again, the domestic political situation in the United States at the moment appears to prevent any optimism with regard to the near term, certainly for the next 6 months or so, ratification of law of the sea. But that, it seems to me, is a very high priority. I've stressed that in the U.S. My colleagues have done the same on the academic side so far without result. And then let me just end on a very sort of broad note. And it is unfortunate that Shen-Ding Li is not here. And I think in the roundtable, the plan is that, to the extent that one can, one will try to represent the unadorned Chinese position. But ultimately, the question, it seems to me, that is at the bedrock bottom of all of our conversations is, what does China want? Does China want more parity with the U.S.? The world is becoming multipolar. And I think American policymakers are increasingly realizing that. That is not a threat from a rational assessment of the American national interest. Or does China want something more? Is the ADIZ really an effort to press outward through the first island chain and on to the second island chain so that China can claim primacy, that's a sort of delicate word, an uglier term would be hegemony, in East Asia? I do not believe personally that there is any serious indication that China would go beyond that to, at least within the next, 20, 30 years, actually try to replace the United States and become some kind of a global hegemon. But if they had the capacity to do so, indeed, later in this century, it might be tempting for them. And one possible answer to this question, and I wish Professor Shen were here, is that China itself doesn't know. That they just don't know. It's ironic that in a non-democratic system, which one would assume would be monocratic, top-down, centralized, there are currents of opinion. There are currents of opinion within the government. What you hear from the PLA or the PLA Navy is not necessarily what you'll hear from the foreign ministry. There are hardliners and there are softliners. And one operational definition of the distinction between the hard and the soft line may be precisely China's dream. What is it a dream of? What objectives are involved? And I want to end on this note, that rather than sort of being sort of platonic and assuming that there is some essence of a goal hanging out there that China is inexorably moving toward, or even is trying inexorably to move toward, the broader issue of China's intentions are very much part of the contingencies and the internal disagreements that are taking place within China, and will actually probably be settled in some ways out of the interaction of China with its neighbors, and also the future of a system that continues to demand the primacy of the Communist Party and inhibits the kind of free discourse that might open up the range of alternatives in the terms of which the China dream could be defined. Which is another way of saying that the future is a big fat question mark, but I do not believe that that question mark cannot be influenced in a direction of certainty that would benefit all of the people who live in East Asia as well as people like myself in California and for that matter in the rest of the world.